Welcome. I'm Kimberly Williams, the CEO of Absorb Software. Absorb offers its learning management system globally, and many companies leverage their LMS to advance their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate the United Nations International Day to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. The 2022 theme is Voices for Action Against Racism, which includes ensuring representation in all areas of decision-making to prevent and combat racial discrimination. What better way to voice for action against racism than by hearing from executives who have overcome obstacles to achieve the highest levels in business? As we hear their stories, I'm sure it will inspire all of you. To introduce these talented executives, I welcome Kristin Schroeder. Kristin is a talent operating partner for Welsh Carson Anderson Stowe, a leading global equity firm. Kristin, tell us about our amazing panelist and today's moderator.
Thank you to Kimberly, the Absorb software team, and to each of our incredibly talented and inspiring panelists today. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce such an accomplished group of healthcare and technology executives, and I'm looking forward to hearing their perspectives today. Barbara Gutierrez is the Chief Financial Officer of Innovate. Innovate is a leading provider of high-quality care programs and services for seniors. The company offers an integrated care delivery system with services ranging from primary and specialty care, transportation, social engagement, home care, and facility care. Adeze Enekwechi joined Welsh Carson as an operating partner last year after a mix of private sector and federal policy roles. Adeze focuses on a policy and regulatory environment that can have an outsized impact on healthcare investments. Alphonse Valbrun is the Chief Legal Officer of Clearwater Analytics. Clearwater Analytics is a SaaS software provider of investment accounting, reporting, and analytics. Clearwater helps its clients worldwide to reduce risk, ensure compliance, and improve performance. Nisha Bagapalli is the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Product Marketing at Link. Link is a leading provider of software solutions that enable K-12 schools to best serve their students, parents, and staff. Chris Canetta is the Chief Product Officer of MMIT. MMIT is a provider of specialty market data and analytics to pharmaceutical and managed care companies. And finally, our moderator for today's session, Rachelle Kelley. Ray is the Vice President of Sales with responsibility for the Global Channel Program at Absorb Software. Ray, I'll now turn it over to you to guide us through today's discussion.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you so much for that introduction. So let's get started. We've developed some questions for our panelists in advance, but we are also taking questions from you, our participants. Click the Q&A and drop your questions right there. All righty, you guys, to get us warmed up, we are going to do a speed round. So Barbara, Nisha, Alphonse, Adeze, Chris, are you guys ready?
Ready.
All right, we're ready to go. So in a quick statement, what piece of advice do you have for adults raising or influencing diverse children that might facilitate their future success, in business?
So I'll repeat what someone once told me, and that is instill the confidence and the belief that you are one among equals, among equals, and you can go wherever your dreams take you.
So I am a similar path. I think that, I want to make sure that our children, especially I say this to my son all the time, your cultural diversity is what makes you really unique. And you should bring those ideas and that energy into every conversation that you have.
I would say that it's important to teach your diverse children to self-advocate. It's important that they understand that they should speak up for themselves in an appropriate way, but that's an important skill that they'll need to develop in life.
My advice is the same advice I would give any other parent or teacher. Maximum exposure to children, to all cultures, all people, all experiences, because it just makes you a well-rounded human being. I think, to the extent the business world is becoming ever more diverse, the more everyone, no different, I think, for children who are Black or Hispanic or other people of color, at least in the United States, the more exposure you have to other cultures, the better it is for you and for the people who have to work with you.
I don't think I can disagree with anything that's been said. I'd simply add, don't ever let your child apologize or be embarrassed for being different. Being different is powerful in its own right. If you all acted the same, thought the same, went about things the same way, life as it is in business would be pretty boring.
Awesome. That was great. So confidence, uniqueness, self-advocacy, exposure. Those are all really good keywords that our future generation needs to hear. So let's shift gears a little bit. Alphonse, the first question is for you. When you think back to your childhood, what role did your parents play in forming your leadership style?
Yeah, so to me, back to my 13-year-old self, I guess, my parents were an impenetrable combination of high expectations, laissez-faire, non-scheduling, and pretty much active opposition to most things that took me away from home. So they never really, scheduled activities for me or told me what, they wanted me to do. But whenever I was interested in something, there were always lots of questions. It was, how are you going to get it done? When are you going to get it done? Often it was, how are you going to pay for it, right? One example is when I was 13 and I wanted to play tennis, they thought I won't say nuts, but they thought that was very ambitious for me because, I had asthma, I had lupus, I had heart surgery a couple of years earlier, and they thought tennis was a bit of a country club sport, right? And so ultimately I had to figure out how I was going to finance it. I had to, arrange the lessons myself at first, and then I got a little bit lucky and I found a coach who was willing to take me on pretty much for free. And now when I look at my team, I tend to be a little bit less, laissez-faire. I do set the direction for them, but I look for people who, the most important thing to me is that I hire people who are motivated to be successful, that they're willing to take the initiative to figure out how to be successful. And then I trust them with appropriate guardrails to get the job done.
Interesting. So your parents took a more independent approach, but in their independence, it helped to create, if you will, your self-motivation, which essentially led you to execution. And now you're seeking out members on your team that can self-motivate and execute. That's awesome. Thank you for that. Adeze, now let's talk a little bit about mentorship. So when people new in their careers come to you for mentorship, how do you advise them to show up as leaders?
So this is such a key question because one assumption in that question is that they're not leaders yet. So these are people who are aspiring to become leaders, but they have started and they are on their journey. One of the things I always tell people, because we all teach based on our own experiences, is that you must be competent. I am, you can probably tell from my name, I am a child of Nigerian immigrants. If you know anything about Nigerians, we are supposed to get as many degrees as possible, starting with doctorates and then everything else. So, that's just sort of the background I come from. And the reason being, get your credentials, educate yourself to the highest degree that you can. It's helpful because I think and that of course assumes competence, that you've learned your craft, you understand your space, you know the history, you know whatever technical issues are relevant to that space. It is a powerful baseline from which to work towards leadership. The other thing I would also suggest is to be curious. You're going to come across lots of different ways of answering questions, lots of different questions, quite frankly, that you may not be exposed to in school or in your own experience, lots of different people. You have to keep an open mind. leadership has tested me in ways that have not necessarily been on the technical. It's on the people, it's on the soft skills, it's on the unexpected, the pandemic. I was running a company during the pandemic. I was not prepared to send 400 people home, but we figured it out. And we had to adapt very quickly to people being in meetings, Zoom meetings with 2 toddlers, and teaching and explaining to your staff, especially the leadership, underneath me. I was the president of the company, to accommodate, because ultimately people everywhere were accommodating. That curiosity, how do we do this well and still maintain a company, is crucial to leadership.
So it sounds like your advice is more along the lines of being flexible and being ready. It might not come to you the way that you think it should come to you, but if you're open and you're ready, and once you get it, then it'll put you on the pathway that you are already on, because you are an inspiring leader. I love how you remove the assumption from that question. That's so true. Now, okay, you guys, we're back to a fast money round. So for all of our panelists, in a quick statement, what piece of advice do you have for someone wanting to be a good ally? In the past couple of years, diversity, equity, inclusion is a topic of conversation now, and people are they're really wanting to know, how can they become a good ally? So what piece of advice do you have for someone wanting to be a good ally?
So I'll start. And I would say that first, really have the courage to step out of your comfort zone, and to recognize that allies come from very diverse and unexpected places themselves. And so, just have the courage to step out of your comfort zone.
Thanks, Barbara. And to add to that, I would say that being an ally is so much more than just being empathetic towards one another. It's about actually taking the first step and doing something with the knowledge that you hold. So it's what we do with that power and that knowledge that really helps build that diverse community around us.
Yeah, that's great. And I would add to that, I would encourage everyone to sort of allies to take a pause, and try to understand whether you're really giving everyone on your team the same opportunity to succeed. Not merely in the formal way, but also in an informal way. Are you giving subtle signals that may suggest that there are members of your team that may be more important than others? I mean, do you cut certain people off? Are you always inviting the same group to coffee? I mean, these things convey important messages about group dynamics, and may indicate that some are valued more than others in the team, and just take real strains to treat everyone the same and fairly.
I really like that, because it's so important and so often sort of forgotten. My contribution to that question perhaps is based on my own experience in healthcare. We've been talking about health equity for a long time, and diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of bubbled up to the top in the last few years. I think in our space, to be a good ally really requires understanding history, because we've got a century of research, probably more than a century of research, around how people who have been traditionally underserved have suffered great consequences. And you don't have to be a mother giving birth, although we hear about that all the time. But that information is often just not there. People have not bothered to read, to educate themselves, and to understand what is actually underpinning some of the buzzwords that we've been hearing. So taking the time to read, educate yourself, and just to get a better understanding of the history. And of course, being, I think Nisha mentioned this earlier, empathy. Empathy goes a long way to helping you listen and just contextualize what people might be relaying to you or conveying to you in any given moment.
I love what was said by the other panelists, and I'll simply add to that. I think the hardest part is you're afraid to ask, right? And there's no such thing as asking a stupid question if you don't have the context there's no such thing as asking a stupid question if it comes from a genuinely compassionate and empathetic place, right? Expressing a genuine interest in understanding a cultural difference or any other difference. I mean, that's how we overcome any innate biases that we might carry.
So that, when I think about what it is, to sum up what you guys are saying, it is pushing past the fear, which is nothing more than being courageous, but also being aware. And as I look in the chat, Natasha, Commander, and Grace, like Natasha is saying, courage is everything, right? So when you said that, it stuck. So all right. Quick reminder that the Q&A is open. So please feel free to drop any questions that you can think of in the Q&A, and we will do our absolute best to get to them. Now let's shift gears and move over to Chris. Chris, are you ready?
I'm here.
All right, here you go. Has your career been influenced by a company's focus on diversity and inclusion? And if so, how?
It's a great question. So I think about 15 years ago, I came across a study that was floating around within my organization at the time. And the study was in particular about Asians in corporate America. And the study found that in the mid ranks of most organizations, Asians performed relatively well, at least relative to other minority groups, right? Outperformed, if that's even the right terminology, but what was used in the study, if it gives you an idea of how long ago that was. But what the study went on to say is that in the executive ranks, Asian representation dropped off substantially, while other minority groups found outsized gains. And as a result, the study went on to show that Asians at mid to upper levels showed significantly higher levels of attrition, even among the highest performing. And so I think the gist of that was, particularly not a surprise in STEM areas, Asians, that the merits of their own work got them on a career path up into a point, right? But that self-advocacy wasn't something that came naturally or comes naturally, particularly if you're, a first generation or second generation Asian in the US, right? We're taught to be judged by the merits of our work, and that should speak for itself. And that life isn't that simple, right? Working in complex organizations isn't that simple. Careers require mentors and advocates and self-advocacy and the development of non-technical skills like communication, empathy, EQ. So from my part, as I learned about this, and I was going through some of my own, questions and challenges in my career at that time, I went and found mentors who embodied some of those skills, and ultimately found a Asian career advocacy group within my organization, and we put a special focus on developing career paths in, let's just say non-traditionally Asian roles like sales, product, innovation, strategy, as opposed to just focusing on the classic engineering type roles. And that was my first real experience, I think, in recognizing that the cultural differences that we all have manifest themselves in different ways throughout our career. And the first thing is to just kind of acknowledge that and think about what is it that I can be doing differently, and what is it that I can be doing to contribute to a broader group.
So part of what it is you said in your response was around self-advocacy. And it is the second time that particular topic has come up. I want to say Alphonse mentioned it earlier. And that leads us to our next Fast Money question session. So for the team, this topic is around self-advocacy. What is your most effective strategy when you need to advocate for yourself?
So I think it's very important to do your homework, have your facts together, and make your advocacy non-emotional, and have your facts together.
Yeah, that actually layers on to something I'm going to bring up. And so Krista Ensley, the CEO of Link, often tells everybody at Link, ask for what you want. Just, it's as simple as that. Just ask for what you want. But to Barbara's point, ask for what you want and deliver the objective of evidence, right? So it's a 2-layer prong. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we just need to reach down deep inside and really ask ourselves, what do we truly want from this? What's our objective?
I think Barbara and Nisha took my answer, but they're basically very much ask for what you want, be specific. I mean, an example is, you know, if you don't believe that you're getting roles that have enough visibility in the organization, then, you know, you could generally say that to your manager, or you can go in with maybe some suggestions for alternatives. Maybe you suggest some projects that you could lead. Rarely have I found that do managers, you know, turn down discretionary effort. They just don't do it, right? We're happy to get people to do as much as they can, you know, and be flexible about it. If they suggest another way for you to do something, then negotiate, right? You can do something and not the other, and get what you want that way.
Yeah, so Barbara and Nisha also took my answer. I think because it's important, I think having your facts straight is crucial. And then having the meeting, right? Asking for what you want. The one thing I might add is that, you know, self-advocacy comes up not always around big things. There could be something that you think is small or not particularly, you know, groundbreaking, but it doesn't exist and it would make a world of difference in your life. And, you know, thinking, and I can give lots of examples. It could be when we start or end meetings. It could be, for me, one example was when I was having a child and I realized in this healthcare company, there was no mother-baby room. And I'm the only Black woman in the entire company, senior woman in the entire, senior Black woman in the entire company. And I had to find the emotional and psychological fortitude to ask for this. It seemed small, it wasn't deliberate, but no one had asked. And I think just remembering that sometimes it's just an oversight and it can make a world of a difference, because of course we got it and everybody benefited, but I had to figure out a way to advocate for myself in that moment.
Yeah, I agree with everything. And Barbara, I think you get the most votes here on the point of bringing facts. And I'll add to that by saying, first, you got to recognize the difference between self-advocacy and self-entitlement. Right? Recognize that nobody owes you anything. So when you advocate yourself, it's not about what you're owed. It's about what you believe you bring to the dynamic of the role or the team, and leveraging facts and supporting experiences to be part of that. It's about being proud of your accomplishments and figuring out a way to tie that work into the merits of what you want in the next phase of your career. But again, it always has to be about, it can never be about what you're entitled to. And if you put that aside, it becomes a non-emotional discussion and centers around facts and having a rational discussion.
So that is at the root of what it is we're trying to achieve as we, you know, are working where we currently are, or potentially trying to position ourselves to move up the career ladder. And it is dealing with how it is we feel about certain situations versus what is factually taking place inside of a situation. So thank you so much for that. There was a question that came up in the chat, and I think it ties directly into what it is we're going to be moving to. So Danya says, can you talk about a time in your career when you had difficulty fitting in because you were different, and then how you overcame it? So the way that fits in is that there is an assumption that fitting in means that you don't belong. And that in and of itself kind of is a different question. But when we're thinking about the overcoming part, like I've lived in this skin for a very long time. So I know all too well the pressures of applying self-pressure and limiting ourselves versus allowing the world or somebody else to limit us. Like we'll do it ourselves, or we'll tell ourselves that we don't fit in. But the question is, and this question is for Nisha, the question is, has there been a time where you have been underestimated or you have underestimated your own abilities? And if so, how did you overcome that thinking? And that's why it attaches so well to the question. How did you overcome your thinking about underestimating your own abilities?
Yeah, I'm going to take you guys down a journey, if I may, because I think, when it comes to ourselves, you're absolutely right that, I think we put a ton of pressure on ourselves on a daily basis. And so we've all heard about imposter syndrome. There's so many different articles out there. I think if you Google it, you'll get about, 2 billion hits. But what we don't necessarily account for is that for people of color, self-doubt and the feeling that we don't belong in a corporate workplace is even more pronounced. So it's the internal factor of being able to doubt yourself, but then there's also some extrinsic sort of, external factors as well. And so at some point in our lives, we were either implicitly or explicitly told that we don't potentially belong in leadership positions. And I'm talking about not just women, I'm just talking about everybody of color. It's probably even more pronounced as a woman. And so a couple of years ago, I had the good fortune of having a great manager who changed that narrative for me and really was that trigger that helped kind of switch the way in which I was viewing things. At that point, I was an exhausted mother. I was brand new to the whole baby thing. Still am. And, I couldn't see past my first baby's year. Like, he was a couple of weeks old, really. I was convinced that I was not capable of leading the marketing team at that point. And I urged my manager at the time, whose name is Matt Ferrari, to hire a CMO. I said, I just can't do this. It's not me. And at one point he turned to me and he said, I already have a CMO. He's like, do the job that you were hired to do. And I think about this specific occurrence almost daily, and I'm getting a little emotional about it. But I think, every single day I think about this occurrence, and I try to turn it into positive inspiration. So I have it on a little post-it note, and I think we're so quick to dismiss our knowledge and skills because that is the thing that we instinctively want to turn to, is that we're not doing enough, or there's something more that we could possibly do. But when in fact we are probably the experts, we just need to channel that self-doubt into motivation that we can use later, and continue to do that every single day and take off bite-sized chunks. And I think that's what's worked for me. And I'd love to hear if there's anything else out there that because when it comes to that, we're so individual, that I'd love to hear, if there's something else that anybody else has sort of incurred that's helped them as well.
So that is fantastic. Like, you've talked about two things, narrative and positive thinking. And when you really sit and you think about it, like you're in charge of your own narrative. So the question becomes, do you want your narrative to be negative in scope of, from an imposter syndrome or self-sabotage or self-deprecating way? Or do you want to tell yourself a narrative of empowerment or that you belong, right? So overcoming a lot of these things is solely rooted in what it is you tell yourself each and every day. And if we're in charge of the narrative, why tell yourself something bad when you can always tell yourself something good, inevitably. So let's switch gears now and let's talk a little bit about skills. So Chris, this question is directed to you. What skills did you need to develop in your career as you transitioned from a manager to a functional leader or executive?
I think as a manager, I probably focused and put overemphasis on teaching, sometimes falsely assuming that at one time or another, I was in your shoes and I know what to do and do what I did. And I think that's effective to a point. But then you have to make the realization that it's less about what I did, and more about, do I understand from where you're coming from, right? Your individual strengths, the situations in which you excel and thrive. Do you thrive with many priorities, or do you need distractions clear to bring your role into focus? And as you shift from, instructing to listening, you become, well, going back to the theme earlier, you become a better advocate, right? You become a better advocate. You can better position the people that ultimately report to you in better position for success. And ultimately, that should also change your own perspective, right? Recognizing that the best teams don't do things the same way, right? And doing it the way I did it isn't necessarily the right way. Because if we're all doing it the same way, again, we're just going to get the same results. So leveraging that and recognizing individual strengths through listening and through that empathy, and less about teaching, I think it was a big transition for me as my career evolved.
Listening, all too important skill that a lot of us speed by in our everyday lives, but it's critical to our success. So thank you for that. All right, looks like we're up to another speed round. So team, are you ready for our next question?
Ready.
This question is going to segue us into a topic that's hot, into questions that are hot and heavy inside of our Q&A. And it specifically is talking about two things: how to help somebody become an ally, but that's not what we're asking right now. This one is specifically about racism. We're going to get to the ally one next. This question is, what advice do you have for people struggling to talk about racism? What advice do you have for people that are struggling to talk about racism?
So I think to start with, try to remember that that likely you're not the only one that's having these thoughts and these concerns, right? You're not alone. And sometimes just finding a comfortable or safe forum or somebody who's like-minded, someone that you can start that conversation with. So seek out somebody who you think respects diversity and respects some of the issues, and start there.
Yeah, exactly, Barbara. I think, to add to that, I wish that not talking about racism or seeing race was a privilege that we all have, but it's not. And I'd say that my piece of advice is to really lean into being uncomfortable, because we just can't afford to not talk about it, and when it's comfortable for everybody.
I would just add that I would probably start out talking about fairness. I think if you start out talking about racism, sometimes that evokes maybe a little bit of defensiveness, and this image of the guy in front of the school trying to keep a little girl from going into the classroom. And it's often not about that, right? It's about fairness, and that's a good place to start talking about, institutionally, just what can be changed to make it fair for everyone.
Yeah, I think, the people who struggle the most to talk about racism are usually not the people experiencing the worst effects of racism. So just to sort of state maybe the obvious. And so if that assumption holds, I hate to sound like a researcher, but just pardon me, but if that assumption holds, then what do we do about it? How do you get to a place where you talk about the elephant in the room, right? My experience suggests that sugarcoating or sort of glossing over, sweeping things under the rug has not really been helpful. We end up having the same conversations and seeing the same negative effects over and over again. So just like Nisha said, leaning into that discomfort, shedding assumptions that one might have, or assuming that what people's experiences are, is so critical. It comes back to empathy, open-mindedness, and just listening, because people who are telling you what their experiences have been and how hurtful or difficult or challenging in a disproportionate way that it has been, have that lived experience matters. So that would be my advice. Lean in, listen, and human tendencies tend to hold. But again, I think if we want a different society, we might have to do things a little bit differently than we have in the past.
I think you have to put the events from which you're trying to address also into context, right? Everything's about context. I think particularly in a corporate setting, my son had a particular challenge several months back, and he brought it to me. And as we talked through it, he actually drew his own very keen conclusion that I had not thought of before. And he said, I think I understand. And it's not that this person is uninformed, but this person has likely been misinformed, right? And how do you put that into context, recognizing that the perspective that someone might have has been informed and shaped by their own families, their own environments, their own surroundings. And if you can put that into context and understand from where that's coming from, you position yourself to lean into that conversation, ask the right questions, as opposed to, building what Alphonse said, making it a contentious, controversial, this is a racism discussion, right? How do you lean into it in a way that draws in their own perspective, and then you get them to share in the empathy that you're trying to create?
So that's why I connected the topics of how do you approach a conversation or talk about racism, along with how do you become an ally? Because a lot of what's fusing those two together is people pushing through fear by being courageous, and then understanding that you don't have to be on the defense to talk about it, just have a conversation, right? And also working on your assumptions. It's just, it's a difficult conversation, but if we're really managing the assumptive portion of it and being courageous, pushing through fear while listening, it can be something new and wonderful will most definitely come out of it. So now I want to check in with our CEO, Kimberly and Kristin. Is there anything you guys would like to add, or any questions that have come up that are worth asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few things that have come up in the Q&A that would be great to talk about. And I'll paraphrase, because I think some of the questions really kind of center around the same question. I think many times people don't realize that they themselves may be exhibiting some unconscious bias behavior. I recognize it as a woman when I interact sometimes with men. They don't recognize maybe that their own behavior might be a little a bias, I would say, or off. And so I guess the question I would have in this that came up is, how do you nudge people to who may be exhibiting those behaviors? How do you nudge them towards, that education, Adazi, that you talked about, or just kind of recognizing their own behavior may be laced with some bias that they may not be aware of? I'm not sure who wants to take that one, but that's the gist of some of these questions.
Well, since you name checked me, Kimberly, I will start. There's actually no easy answer to that question. It is really hard. And by the time you get to the point of thinking about strategies to nudge someone, you've been deliberating, thinking about how this can go wrong, perseverating. You've likely been hurt, perhaps even. So I think that one has to do that carefully, because whether we like it or not, there's a defensive posture that typically comes with conversations like this, even if the offense is glaring. So just being prepared for a rough first start, I think is always helpful. I sometimes don't necessarily wait for a problem. I find that a historical grounding in the work that we do, again, I'm speaking specifically to healthcare, is so foundational. I often recommend history books. So even when I got to Welsh Carson, I gave one of my colleagues, one of the partners, a couple of books on history. I said, if you're going to be in healthcare, which of course we've all been for 20 something years, we should have a better understanding of some of the contextual issues that continuously surround our area. But I would just approach hard conversations carefully, sort of go back to what psychologists often suggest using, was it I feel statements as opposed to you did. I forget what the flip is, you did or you caused. Stick to I feel, and perhaps invite that person to think about it, have another conversation after they've thought through things, so everyone is kind of calm and has had a moment to sort of breathe. And seek help, get a mediator, a third party to help you facilitate the conversation if necessary, if it's gotten to that level.
Great. Another question, I think Barbara, actually, you had mentioned, maybe a few people did, about addressing issues in maybe a non-emotional way. And the question is, it is emotional when something happens. It is emotional, and I think probably the advice people gave was not about it's inappropriate. I mean, certainly when things happen, the attacks that we're having today in the New York City area against Asians, or when we had Breonna Taylor who got murdered in her home, they're just emotional. I mean, to not show emotion, I think, is for anybody difficult. But I think probably the sense when you said, let's try to deal with things with fact instead of emotion, might come more from when you yourself are sensing some discrimination or some unfairness in the workplace, that it's maybe important to kind of keep that even keel. Why is that important, do you think, to bring the facts as opposed to emotion into those conversations?
I think it plays off of, I think it was Alphonse, and forgive me if I attribute the concept incorrectly, but I think you mentioned fairness. And I think, if you kind of just go back to that fairness concept, I think it just becomes a more rational conversation if you kind of keep that in mind. And just to maybe piggyback off of that whole discussion and what Adeze just mentioned, I think another strategy is also just asking some questions and asking for context. And that's also a strategy I find effective. I observed that I heard this, I observed, can you give me a little context for your remarks, or a little context? And I think just if you phrase it that way, sometimes it almost forces the conversation to go a little deeper without being defensive. So there's just some ideas.
Great. Another question that we had, and Chris or Founder, maybe one of you could take this question, but just advice about creating a workforce that is more inclusive, that does welcome people, even if you're a department, right? Like within a bigger company, you kind of control as a leader sort of the culture of your department. Advice on creating a diverse and inclusive workforce.
Yeah, it's a great question. First, I think it's about how, as a leader, you are signaling intent and you're signaling good intentions, right? And so, taking the example that we just, Barbara was just sharing, I look at it the same way as a leader. My job is to ask why, ask for that context. Put those practices into reality in my day-to-day conversations to create that context, and hopefully, in so doing, you make it safe for other people to engage in that. I think that's one. I think two, this is a conversation we have at MMIT. There's so much happening in the world, right? And you want to be responsive and empathetic and understanding of the conflicts and where we're seeing strife and unfairness. But it's also not realistic to address every possible situation with great detail and great empathy. So how do you demonstrate that empathy? within the context of your culture, right? And I think it starts with the culture that you're trying to create within the organization, whether that's based on zero tolerance, whether that's based on a great deal of compassion and empathy, whether that's trying to create a culture of resilience. All of those things start with having strong principles as a leader that you reflect and recognizing I can't control everything that happens in the world, but I can control the cultural dynamic of my team, of my organization, and ensuring that you embody that in a genuine and compassionate way.
Great. You want to take, Alfonso, maybe you can take this one kind of from the other direction. So you're a junior employee, you're not a leader in an organization. How can you best influence, do you think, the culture of the organization so that it's more inclusive? Like, what role can you play as a junior employee to create that environment?
So I think that as a junior employee, it is important to look around, look for, I think it was mentioned earlier, it is important if you are junior to look for allies in the organization. So, more senior, potentially like-minded individuals who can, who may have a little bit more influence, a little bit more ability to, I don't like to put it this way, but maybe sometimes take some blowback if need be, right? And then, have conversations about, situations that you may see or things that you may want. Then again, it comes back to that self-advocacy, but then it's a little bit more of, okay, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I believe would be incredibly helpful for the organization. So you have to, still come to it with that. Here's what we can do to make this place better, right? And hopefully you come out of that interaction with some specific ideas, some specific plans that you can put together and then disseminate through the organization. I think that if you are a junior employee, it tends to be difficult to sort of on your own cause change, but it's important for you to then start the movement. And there are lots of organizations, I think, that they don't have an active opposition to a movement. It just may be that no one has thought of it yet, or no one has started it. No one has, just been that advocate for change. And why not you?
Right. Nisha, any advice for people who, want to be a visible ally to people that, maybe you're not a person of color, but you really want to support the diversity and people of color and help them in their career and as a coworker? Any advice for kind of being known for that or stepping out into that role? Or Barbara, you want to take it? Yeah.
Sure.
Can you all hear me? I think we're having.
I'll jump in, and then Nisha, if you get your audio to work, come behind me. I think it really speaks to a broader concept that I'm really passionate about, and I think that is about mentorship. And I really think that we as in the business world need to do a better job of developing programs where people can be mentors and that mentees can seek out those mentors. Because I think about in my career, having somebody in your corner and having that sounding board, and quite often not even somebody in your own discipline, those I remember those people very distinctly, and those people really encouraged me, and I think put me well onto my journey. So I would say it's a lot about mentorship, and if your company doesn't have a formal mentor program, seek mentors even outside of your company and in other places. They can be in very unusual places. So something I'm very, very passionate about. And because of my past experiences, I try to pay it forward with some of the younger people, junior people today.
Nisha, it looks like you might have gotten reconnected.
I
Thoughts on-
apologize for that.
No, that's okay.
Yes.
That's right. It's the
Yeah,
technology world we live in sometimes.
We're having a storm roll into Austin. So anyway, yeah, I think, you know, in general, I would say, and I mentioned this before, but one of the most important things when it comes to wanting to be an ally or allyship in general is just to be able to take that knowledge and take it one step further. And I always tell people, right, what are you going to do if you don't happen to be of a diverse background? How are you going to educate yourself? How are you going to talk to other folks? What are you going to do with the quote unquote power that you have that other people don't?
Yeah.
It out or saying that, you know, I'm not a racist, or I believe in racism, but I'm not specifically racist. Being able to just call that out, I don't think is enough. Being able to take it and actually contribute to your community, look around you and make your group of people are diverse as well, right? Making sure that you're always taking it one step further is something that I think about not only for myself, but also for other people that I meet, right? I continue and I take this responsibility very seriously. I think we've talked a lot about just educating others, being able to use history as context, being able to use objective evidence. I think us all, like in general, our community of being able to take that evidence and take it one step further every single day and make strides, I think is so important.
Great, thank you. Adazi, you had mentioned that you went work at home, obviously, when COVID hit and was running a company at the time, making that transition. Thoughts on, how maybe a remote work environment, use special things you can do to create an environment of diversity and inclusion. What advantages does it have to us? What obstacles does it have, et cetera? Thoughts on that?
Well, such an appropriate question, given how work has changed in the last couple of years. And we were all drinking from the fire hose if any of us were in management positions in the last couple of years. So I think some lessons or some strategies that that I might share, it comes to, who is in leadership really matters. I think it was Alphonse who mentioned, just going back to the question around more junior people recommending certain things. You can believe, I'm sure some of you saw some of the best ideas we had about helping and creating a more conducive environment for working at home came from more junior staff. People in C-suite tend to have a different set of resources available to them than younger staff or more junior staff might have. So I would we basically suggested to the team, it was a strong suggestion, but if someone is no longer able to have a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning because kids are waking up and they're feeding them, this is an immediate aftermath of everybody working at home. You're gonna have to make some of those allowances, and perhaps the meetings should hold from 10 to 3:30. And if people are not able to be on camera, initially we had this sort of unspoken rule that everybody had to be on camera. If that's not possible for certain people in the company, we're gonna have to make some of those allowances. So it started off with little things like that, but they were huge for staff who were navigating major shifts in how they work. I think what we see some companies doing now is a much more flexible approach to work. Is everybody going to be ready or willing to come back 100% into the office? It's possible. In fact, it's likely, if we're reading the articles and looking at some of the surveys coming out, that's unlikely. And so, management needs to rethink, what does fully returning to normal look like in the coming years, coming months and years, quite frankly, as we navigate this new normal. when I was running the company I was running, we had younger staff come up with something called the Culture Committee. So up until I joined, there'd never been a senior woman or anyone of color in the executive team, let alone running the company. And so there was, you had young folks who felt empowered to come and pitch to me that they wanted a culture committee. And it was actually multiracial. And they wanted a place to feel like they could create their own allies. I wasn't necessarily invited to the meetings, I was management, but to allow them to host lunches among themselves with different people from different countries and different backgrounds, bringing in their own dishes, having competitions. It was a jollof rice competition among many of the West Africans. And it was so much fun. It was actually one of our better recruiting tools. You had people recruit from their top policy and other master's programs saying, come work here because you're going to feel like you're home. And I find that who you have in leadership is critical to facilitating and creating the kinds of environments we've been talking about today. So I just wanted to make sure to amplify that because we haven't talked about that. So good intentions matter. People in positions of power who can actually effectuate some of these changes is really what's at issue.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that comment. We have about a minute and a half left, so I wanted to close us out with a speed round. Adeze, you mentioned earlier that becoming a better ally is about getting educated. So with that being said, what is your favorite, and this is for everybody, what is your favorite nonfiction book? Specific, maybe one that could even help somebody along their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey.
So I always get the advantage of going first. So sorry, folks, but likely won't have the same book. So one of my favorite books is actually a business leadership book that I think applies to all situations, whether it's diversity or just all situations. And it's a book called The Leadership Challenge that has 5 concepts about leadership. I won't read them all to you, but the beginning is model the way and the end is encourage the heart. And I think those are 2 very, very key principles when we're talking about diversity and inclusion.
So mine is called We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Adichie. And I think in general, right, there's just such a negative connotation, or there has been such a negative connotation about feminists in general or feminism. And I think that over the years, it's just evolved to just women having the power of choice. I think I live it day in and day out as a 2nd generation immigrant, being able to make a choice for myself when my ancestors couldn't. And so it's a really telling story. And I think everybody, man or woman, should read it because we should all be raising feminists, whether that's a man or a woman.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think that, let's see, my favorite nonfiction book is an old one. It's Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And I think of it as, having lots of examples of how extrinsic factors help explain success. We often think of success as, caused by individual brilliance or great physical prowess. Oftentimes it's a head start or some factors that contribute to success. Of course, you've got to have individual hard work as well. But I think for me, it always encourages me to look at societal forces and what's behind success.
I have 2, of course. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel, which is it's an epic nonfiction book about the migration from the South to the North. Which is the largest human migration, unforced and sort of, voluntary migration, African Americans from the South to the North. And I think one that just came out recently that I just find to be such a powerful account of how policy interacts with pretty much every other discipline is a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. Came out last year, I think, late last year. It is a wonderful book about how things that we take for granted, especially around some of the topics we've been talking about, race, etc., have been deliberate decisions around where people live, whether we invest in swimming pools and other community assets, and the effects of that we don't want, but they keep happening. So I highly recommend that book.
My wife made me promise not to list a business book when I was reading her these questions. So I'm going to list two. The first is the Algebra of Happiness by Scott Galloway. And somebody who's been in and around business, but in a very non-business perspective, talks about his learnings and how we really derive happiness in the life that we lead. And the second book, more probably in tune to the topic of inclusion, is a book called The Awakening of Hk Dairyberry. It was very popular a few years back, but really a story of a single man befriending a boy with cerebral palsy, and the journey that these two people take with really zero assumptions about the other person and the impact they collectively had on each other.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing with the participants what you're reading in your downtime. Thank you so much for that. We've come to the close of our ally session. Wow, such an important conversation about how becoming courageous while approaching emotional topics will continue to push the conversation forward. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the United Nations International Day to Eliminate Racial Discrimination. I hope today's session provided you with ideas and inspiration. Please join us on May 17th for our next Ally Chat, where our panel will support International Day against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. Until next time, remember, each of us can be an ally and make each of our companies a better, more inclusive environment. Thank you so much. Bye.